Welcome to the Breaking Average podcast, the podcast designed to challenge you to break the mold that average has on the world. Each episode offers insights directly from those who choose to break average every day. Now for the latest insights, here are your hosts, Paul Gustafson and Barry Smith.
Welcome to the Breaking Average Show. I am with Barry Smith, and boy, we've had some fun, haven't we?
Always, man. That's what we do.
Hey, listen, first of all, at the time of this recording, you have just Florida. You're in Florida. You guys just had a hurricane. It happens at least once a year. And you guys doing well?
We're doing fine. Being on the Atlantic side and in southern Florida, we just got tropical storm impacts, which is really like a extended thunderstorm. But certainly thoughts and prayers out to our friends on the Gulf side, and even up in northern Florida, up towards the Panhandle on the Atlantic side, with a lot of storm surge and flooding, heavy rain. So yeah, Florida is definitely taking a hit here in this last week. And I think last I heard they were coming up on 100 confirmed deaths. So this one hurts a little bit, and a long way to go to come back. So definitely thoughts and prayers to everybody impacted by Ian. Thanks for mentioning that, Paul.
Yeah. Definitely been praying. And we just, for anybody in harm's way from that hurricane, if, wherever you're at, hopefully you're well. So we appreciate you watching and listening, and hopefully you're going to get some encouragement today. We had a chance to sit down with Jason Turbow just recently, and it was just an amazing conversation. Jason is the co-author of this fairly brand new book. You may recognize that guy. Do you recognize that guy, Barry?
Kenny Loggins.
It's Kenny Loggins. He's got a autobiography, but it was co-authored by Jason Turbow. And great conversation. So let's kind of unpack that. We've got this interview. We're going to do this in two parts. So for today's discussion, we want you to just kind of lean in and listen on this. And Barry and I are going to come back and share some thoughts, some takeaways from our discussion. But it was a great interview. So Barry, you ready to dive in? Let's play this interview, right?
Let's go.
All right. So here it is, Jason Turbow. All right, I am sitting down with Jason Turbow. And Barry, this is going to be fun. We've got a conversation here with a co-author of a book, and really probably I can't wait to kind of break down this book that we're going to talk about. But he's written other books too. So Jason, welcome to the Breaking Average podcast. Glad to have you here.
Hello, Paul and Barry. Great to be here.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
and tell everybody where you're located just real quick. So we have that.
Located in Berkeley, California, just across the Bay Bridge from San Francisco.
There you go. And that's one of my favorite all-time family vacations, was taking the family out there, San Francisco and Golden Gate, and going over to see Pixar and then Yosemite. And we did the whole Northern California tour. It was pretty awesome. So I know it's a beautiful part of the world, but glad to have you on here.
You hit Pixar, you hit Yosemite. You got it covered.
I did. We came around there and came down to Monterey, just did the whole thing. It was great. And as we were driving, Barry, you'll get a kick out of this. So my oldest son, his name's Michael. We're driving by Pebble Beach, and he says, "Dad, stop the car." I'm like, "What? What's wrong?" He goes, "Just stop." So I stopped the car. He jumps over the fence at Pebble Beach, the golf course. He says, "Take a picture." I want a picture that I was on Pebble Beach. I'm like, "All right, there you go. We got it."
Yeah,
so we got a picture.
They actually, I didn't know this till I stumbled on it. They opened that golf course to the public towards sundown. Once all the golfers have cleared off, you can walk that whole thing.
Wow.
Turned out my dog actually did his business on one of the greens. It made me feel terrible.
Oh,
I
man.
had a bag, but that's my bragging point now. My dog has pooped in Pebble Beach.
There you go. So cool. And it's great to have you here. And you've been writing for a while. Tell us a little bit about your experience writing. I know it's newspapers and books and things of that sort. So just give everybody a little flavor of some of the stuff that you've been doing.
Yeah, many years in newspapers. I worked for the San Francisco Chronicle for 5 years, running a Giants-centric page, a full page they ran every time the team played at home. And I moved from there right into books. first book was about baseball's unwritten rules, which everyone has heard so much about, especially as of late.
Yeah.
The Astros sign stealing scandal took front and center spotlight. My book came out 7 years before that. So spending untold time in big league clubhouses, talking to big league players about the unwritten rules. It's really just a platform to tell great baseball stories. And I'm a sucker for a great story, especially a great baseball story, which is kind of what has fed my entire career.
Yeah.
So moving from there into a book about the swinging A's of the 70s, and from there into a book about the 1981 Dodgers, which has its own multitude of fabulous storylines, and then into the most recent book, which I wrote with Kenny Loggins about his life and career.
Yeah, so cool. Yeah, I've got the list of books here. You got the baseball codes, the dynastic, bombastic, fantastic, which is about the A's, right? And I know, Barry, you gotta. I'm sure you're itching to read that book, right, buddy?
Oh man, that's the era I grew up in, and that was my team, man.
Yeah,
that team has so many great stories.
Oh my gosh.
On one hand, it's this incredibly underserved baseball team. It's the only team other than the Yankees to have won 3 straight World Series championships. And no one seems to remember that. But on the other hand, these guys were known primarily for their fistfights in the clubhouse with each other. And their owner, who none of them could stand. I think the defining characteristic of this team, I won't dive too deep into the baseball woods because I know this isn't a baseball podcast. But they won the 1973 World Series. It was their second straight title. They beat the New York Mets in 7 games. And their manager was so disaffected by the entire scene that he quit in the clubhouse with champagne flying around him. He couldn't take anymore. And that's kind of the dynamic of how that team ran itself.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. And I guess, are you guys Moneyball fans? Do you like that movie?
It's a tricky answer. Yeah. I very much enjoy the movie, but the movie is more fiction than nonfiction.
Yeah.
They built so much into that movie that just wasn't accurate. The book was fantastic. Michael Lewis's book is incredible.
It is a good book.
But if you watch the movie, they don't actually mention the fact that they had the defending MVP or Cy Young Award winner on that team, which had a big reason to do with the success, not the Moneyball guys, the lesser known players. But I think what everyone around Oakland is not happy about is that Art Howe, the manager, was the nicest guy in baseball history. He was just such a sweetheart of a man, and he was portrayed as the bad guy in the movie, to the point where the A's assistant general manager, Paul DePodesta, would not let his name be associated with the movie. Wow. So Jonah Hill's character is an invented character to stand in for the guy who wouldn't let his likeness be utilized, mostly because of how Art Howe was portrayed.
I did not know that. Wow. Yeah. So you guys, right here on the Breaking Average, you're getting some inside tips on some of the real truths of baseball and life here. So that's pretty good. I like that.
We got the go-to source now. We know where to go.
Yeah, I like it. So anything and all things baseball, Barry, we're gonna go to Jason on stuff. So this is good. Here's another book you did. They Bled Blue, right? So that's about the Dodgers.
1981 Dodgers. Yeah. And then another underserved World Series champion. That 1981 season had the confluence of baseball's biggest in-season strike. It divided the season so thoroughly that baseball decided to crown a first half champion and a second half champion, which really worked in the Dodgers' favor because they did not have the best overall record that year. They probably wouldn't even have made the playoffs if not for that. They had an all-time storied infield of Steve Garvey, Davey Lopes, Bill Russell, and Ron Cey, who played together literally twice as long as the next most durable infield in big league history. Wow. Many storylines, none bigger than Fernando Valenzuela.
Yeah.
And the rise of Fernando Mania.
I remember that.
And I'll condense this down as much as possible, but the Dodgers playing in Los Angeles, and LA had the biggest concentration of Mexicans anywhere on the planet outside of Mexico City. And the Dodgers had been trying to tap into that for literally decades, almost since they moved to Los Angeles. And they just couldn't do it. They couldn't find a Mexican player who resonated with the local community. Their general manager kept saying he wanted somebody to activate the local Mexicans the way that Sandy Koufax had activated the Jews. And it wasn't until Fernando came along, this unheralded kid out of nowhere. He was like number 5 on the depth chart at best as a rookie to start the 1981 season. a series of injuries had him on the mound on opening day. Like no one expected this. He threw a shutout.
Yeah.
And in his next game, he threw another shutout. And his next 6 games after that, he threw more shutouts. It was the best start to a big league career in Major League history. He was a bona fide phenomenon.
Yeah.
But what really was impressive to me was as this guy was making big league hitters look foolish, his manager, Tommy Lasorda, said, it's almost as if he thinks there's a better league than this one, and he's trying to play his way out of Los Angeles. As he was doing this, Los Angeles erupted. Fernando Mania was a real thing. It wasn't some marketing department driven shtick. Like Los Angelinos went nuts for this guy. And the grandstand at Dodger Stadium turned into one giant mariachi party. Their longtime Spanish language broadcaster, Jaime Jarrín, told me that nobody in the history of baseball has single-handedly created more fans than Fernando Valenzuela did that year. And I find that claim to be entirely believable.
That's amazing. Again, I'm learning stuff right here, huh, Barry? This is pretty cool.
No doubt. I remember Fernando days, man. That was crazy. A lot of big picture stories around the Dodgers, Oral Hershiser and others. So, yeah.
For sure. Stuff. They cranked them out.
Yep.
Pretty phenomenal. And then you had another book called Baseball Forever. So yeah, you've got a few of those, but then you've pivoted a little bit. So how in the world did you get involved in supporting the memoir of a music icon? This is a great book, by the way. So I'm just going to plug it real quick. Here it is. Still All Right. Kenny Loggins. And I'm telling you, if you want a good Audible book to listen to, that's the one to listen to. It's really good.
Yeah, the Audible is especially good because Kenny himself narrates it.
It is so good. It's really well crafted. And just, as I shared before we turned on the record, I got a chance to listen to another podcast that you did. And I realized after listening to that there was some work that had to be done to create that. But before we dive into the process, tell me, how did you get involved in supporting that?
Oh, that story is not nearly as interesting. I mean, my agent knew a guy. That's basically what it boils down to.
Yeah.
I'd been looking to branch out away from baseball a little bit. Not to replace baseball. I have more baseball books in the pipeline, but I didn't want to have all my eggs in that one basket for too long. And my agent was in touch with the people putting this together, and it worked out. I mean, thankfully, having a good reputation in an industry does pay off occasionally. Yeah. So I, me and Kenny had a couple days together, kind of a chemistry test. I went down to Santa Barbara and hung out with him, mostly to put the pitch together and also to see how well we work together. We got along famously. We hung out in his backyard and shot the breeze for 2 straight days. Put a pitch together, and before that pitch sold, the pandemic hit.
Oh no!
Which put a delay on everything. I mean, we spent a lot of time kind of in a holding pattern, but it turned out to be really beneficial in one way, which is before the pandemic, my plan was just to take long working trips to Santa Barbara and spend 3-4 days with him at a time and do as much work as we could. But one thing that happened when we went into lockdown was the existence of Zoom became widespread.
Yeah.
And so instead of, 3-4 hours a day, 3-4 days in a row, we had 2-3 hours a day every day. And Kenny's in his 70s. He's not talking for 8 hours straight, but we got a couple hours for sure every day. And it was, that workflow was really, really effective.
Yeah. That's pretty cool, right? So you guys leveraged the technology that was there right in the midst of, COVID, a pandemic. You guys wrote really what I'm sure is a bestseller book, right? And
it's been doing well.
And I'm sure the process to write that book was that kind of a new process for you?
Yeah, it was my first autobiography, for sure. I mean, I'm used to telling people stories in the third person.
Yeah. And
in many ways, this is easier because, for example, I'm going to tell a story from the 1970s A's. I've got to get corroboration. I've got to have people confirm that's what happened, get as many different viewpoints on it as I can. I mean, one of my favorite stories from 1972 is a clubhouse fight in Arlington, which I'll give you the details later if you want them.
Yeah.
But I talked to probably 8 people who were there, and I got 8 conflicting stories. And what do you do with that? It happened 40, 50 years ago. Like, no one's at fault here, but those are the kind of issues I have to deal with as a straight journalist. When I'm writing a biography, like if there's ever doubt, I just put it in quotes and, as best I remember it, and that covers it, right?
Yeah. I think it was Kenny who said the subtitle should have been "As Best I Remember It," right? So.
Yeah. He's fond of saying that our conversations were a cross between deposition and therapy. And it's totally true, man. I mean, one of the benefits of talking for 3 hours a day is we went deep on stuff. And sometimes we spent 3 hours talking about things that never made it into the book.
Yeah.
And he would get really emotional. And there were tears, there was anger. Like we got deep into this stuff.
Wow.
And really to the benefit of the book. I mean, I think that's part of what makes it so good is he's very open and very honest. But the flip side of that coin is, I would have to do my due diligence. And if he told me something that happened at a certain time with certain people, I would occasionally come back to him and say, you know what, it didn't happen that way. And here's how I know, because there's this news report that happened before the thing you said happened. So the timeline can't work out the way you said it. And then we would both be very confused for a while. And I'd have to interview lots of other people to figure out exactly what was going on.
So his multiverse was different than what was actually, and that happens, right? So we start to think of different things and how things played out. And,
I'm the same way. I mean, we probably all are trying to remember what happened a year ago. Did it happen last year or 2 years ago?
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, and now we're talking about 40 or 50 years ago. Things really tend to blur together.
Did you have to reach out to some other folks too? I mean, was this?
Oh yeah.
I mean, you obviously did a lot of digging, a lot of research, but were there other conversations with, Michael McDonald and folks like that?
Yeah, I talked to everybody I could, and that's really, really helpful. And talking to musicians is one thing. I had a couple of good conversations with Jim Messina, for example, who filled in some details. But it's really the ancillary people whose names you might not know, who could fill in details about what happened at the times the media wasn't watching, and who Kenny was at that time. And like I got some stories about concerts he attended at the Hollywood Bowl, how he took acid and saw Jimi Hendrix. He actually didn't remember that at all, maybe because he was on acid. But I talked to one of his good friends from back then who filled me in on everything. And Kenny said, yeah, everything he said kind of sounds right. And so like I was able to backfill a lot of stories that Kenny just didn't remember, or only remembered once I started to cue him in on things other people had told me. So
what was that like if you're sharing him with him information that he doesn't remember, and you're like, I'm sharing him some stuff that he probably doesn't want to know about, but I got to tell him so that we can write this book. Yeah. Were there moments like that? Not really. Again, because this is an autobiography, it's all basically off the record until Kenny puts it on the record. Yeah. So it's not like I've got a gotcha moment and right. Here's something I'm going to be running with tomorrow, which is the other part of what makes this an easier project than third person. I doing my A's book and my Dodgers book, I did have to go to the principals there and say, here's some difficult issues that I need to write about, and I would love your perspective on it. Yeah. And you don't have to talk if you don't want to, but if you don't, then I'm just going to have these other people's perspective. And generally that goes pretty well, but it does create some unpleasurable, some kind of intense moments that is just not the case when you're working with someone who has creative control. And I think one of the reasons the book worked with me and Kenny is he left a lot of the framework up to me and the verbiage up to me. And he did press pause on a couple of topics. Really, hardly any though. Like he's very open and honest in this book. Well, and that's what I love about this book is that you really feel like you're getting a sense of what it was like for him, and he's not pulling back, he's not holding back on information, and he's very honest and sincere, and that goes, that really speaks to me in terms of the process that you guys had in writing this and be able to really kind of lay it all out there and kind of line it up. And I think that's why this book is genuine. It's not some good word. It doesn't feel fictitious at all. It feels like, okay, wow, this is what it's like to be in the shoes of Kenny Loggins?
Yeah, I mean, and it was a pretty intense process. I mean, apart from the therapy and the depositions, we'd have these long conversations, and I ended up putting the manuscript together as based on his conversations, and I tried to keep his words as he said them as wherever I could. And he read this manuscript and frequently said, "This doesn't sound like me," and he ended up rewriting the whole thing.
Wow,
almost soup to nuts. And what he turned back to me was not very usable, because Kenny he's a good writer and he's a good storyteller, but he writes in small snippets and not in the context of a larger framework. So he'll start off on a story that I detailed and then spin it out from that moment like 10 years forward.
Yeah.
And I'd have to go back and say, "Kenny, you just covered like 6 chapters and you're rewriting this story." And then I would rewrite it back so it very much resembled the first thing I did. Yeah. While integrating a bunch of the verbiage in his rewrite. And it was really a nice melding of both of our worlds. And then the final step, and this was all him, man. I'd never done anything like this before. He's a musician, and if you look at his catalog, almost everything he's done, almost every hit he's had, has been a collaboration with somebody else. He's a firm believer that working with other people will bring out the best in yourself. And he's realized over the years that working with a certain kind of musician will give him a certain kind of output, and the other direction is true as well. So he kept saying, "Let's jam on this thing." Yeah. Like, as a musician, jamming means one thing. I'd never jammed on anything as a writer. Yeah. But we ended up sitting down and he read the entire manuscript out loud. And we would pause frequently. And either he or I would say, "This doesn't strike me quite right. Or maybe we could say this a little bit better. Or maybe this is a space for a different kind of story."
Yeah.
And that process was unbelievably time consuming. Like, I don't know if you've ever, like, you've listened to his audiobook and however long it is, 8-10 hours. I've narrated 2 of my own audiobooks. It takes a week of straight of narrating to get that 8 or 10 hours. So reading this thing out loud together it took a long time.
I can't even imagine that. Right. So let's make sure we cover this, because I heard this in the other podcast too. He actually verbally orated so what was written, he sat and he actually read it back to you over a Zoom call. Is that right?
Correct. Over many days and many weeks with frequent pauses to, adjust things. Wow. Part of his concern was that he had the audiobook in mind. He wanted to know what it sounded like audibly.
Yeah.
And I think rightly he figured that if it sounded good audibly, it would work well on the page. Yeah. And it did. It did. And some of our best material came out of that process. Like, the book definitely got improved. And speaking personally, I know it worked when I hit a line, like a really good line, kind of rereading a passage for some reason or other. And I'm not sure if it's Kenny's line or my line.
Yeah.
And like, okay, I guess this partnership was really pretty cohesive.
Definitely. And that's the sense I got after, especially that interview. And I went back and I'm like, wow, all his great songs, and you've already mentioned it here, there were collaborations. Like, every collaboration he did with Michael McDonald was a hit, right? David Foster, right? All these different artists. And I'm like, he just collaborated on this book. And there's some elements to this thing that are really strong. One of the things, I just want to kind of rewind the tape here for half a second, because this reading, right, as we write, and, Barry's an author, I'm an author as well. One of the powers of writing, and maybe this is a tip for somebody watching this and listening to this podcast. I had a teacher, his name was Mr. Gregory, back in 8th grade. And his claim to fame was he was the college roommate to Fred Biletnikoff. So I'm just connecting to you guys, because I know you guys are Fred Biletnikoff. Back to the Raiders. All right. We're back 25. To the Raiders. All right. So his roommate was Fred Biletnikoff. So he had all sorts of great stories. But fast forward to my situation with Mr. Gregory, he had us write a report, kind of economics report. And then we had to turn it in. But when we turned it in, he said, "Okay, guys, before you turn it in, you're going to read it. Read it outside, read it to everybody in the class." And I was picked first guy. I got to read it. I read it. It didn't read right. And he said, "Okay, Paul, I'm sorry that I picked you. I could have picked anybody. But before you turn in that paper, I'm going to give you guys an extra 48 hours. I want to make sure that your paper will read, write audibly. If it doesn't, don't turn it in. And that has stuck with me to this day. So every time I write, I try to make sure it sounds like me, and that's what the sense was that I got as I heard that. And as you just shared that a moment ago, that with Kenny, as he was reading it, he wanted to make sure it sounded right. And I think that's a powerful element. It's a lot of labor, right? But there's fruit in that, right? There's a return on investment.
Especially in a collaboration. And I've never really considered this before now. So this is me thinking out loud with you. But, I'm a professional writer, right? It's what I do. Yeah. I work hard at my craft, but obviously there's an innate talent that led me here. It's the reason I do this and not something in the mathematics field.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that comes really easily to me as I write is the ability to synthesize how it would sound out loud without having to read it out loud. I can just see the written page and I get it.
Yeah.
And the comment I'm constantly getting is that my nonfiction books read like novels. And that's intention on my part. I try and lay them out that way, but I think it's partly a result of my ability to kind of feel how something would sound out loud without having to read it out loud. And in a collaboration, we didn't have like this. There's two opinions going back and forth. So reading it was the best way to do it. I'm working on a book right now with somebody else who is not so inclined to read it out loud, and that's fine. Like he's willing to give it all up to me, and great. That's okay. It's much, much easier. But in some ways, I'm kind of thirsting. Like, read this out loud. Tell me what you think.
Yeah, that's cool. And Barry, you've collaborated. I know you've helped write some books for some folks. And what was that process like for you?
Well, I think, to Jason's point, it's finding that voice. I've been accused in a lot of what I've written of writing like I speak, and I've taken that as a compliment. I mean, that's what I want to produce. Now, am I that good and that intentional about it? No, I just write. It comes out that way. So maybe that's kind of part of a gift. But I think the collaboration idea again, and Paul, you and I have had, a number of mentors that have helped us along the way. And it's finding that voice, Jason, I don't think you know him, but Paul Martinelli has been a very influential guy in Paul in my life. And, it's always read it out loud, because if you're not communicating in a way that people hear, you're not delivering the message. And if that's coming out of a written word, then you've got that challenge in there. So I love what you're saying. It makes me more excited to read more of your work, man. For real.
Yeah. Thanks. And I'll take it a step further. Like I said before, my first pass at this, I tried to use as much verbatim from Kenny as I could, and based on our conversations. And part of his reading was, you know what? I actually don't want it to be quite this verbal. Like if you're just reading a transcript of speech, like sometimes it just doesn't work that well. Yeah. So finding that fine line between what sounds good out loud and how you actually say something is also an important factor.
Yeah, that's good. I would imagine with all the Zoom calls, I don't know if you guys recorded it, but I'm like, he probably could have done the audible just in the readbacks. And I'm sure he sat in the studio afterwards and reread it again, but
Yeah, reading an audiobook is an involved process.
With a
producer in a sound booth and they're pressing pause a lot. And if you even have like at the tiniest of ticks in your inflection, they pause and rewind immediately, and you just redo it in the moment. It's a whole deal.
It's a big deal. So tell us, what was the most satisfying part of the process? All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that first half of the interview with Jason Turbow. And I asked him the question, what was the most satisfying part of the process? And you guys are just going to have to stay tuned for next week when we share the second half of this interview. But Barry, let's kind of break down this first part, right? That was a great discussion, wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Great guy.
So what kind of stood out for you? Let's just kind of unpack the interview a little bit, and then let's dive into one of the elements of the power of imagination. We're talking about the power of assessment here in just a few minutes, but I thought this was a good lead in for where we're going to go. But what stood out with you in terms of just getting a chance to meet Jason and some of the highlights from that?
Yeah, I think aside from being a sports fan, like both of us are, and having that connection, I just think the creativity, his approach to taking on a book project, and certainly he shared some of his earlier books, and that's leading up now to the work he just did with Kenny Loggins. But I think the creativity and the approach of him looking at his work, really focused on the message he wants to deliver, how he wants to deliver it, and that satisfying element in what the finished product looks like. As authors, as both of you and I are certainly not to his level yet,
Yeah,
right?
not yet.
But it's impressive to see someone who takes so much pride in their craft, in his case, writing, and hearing a little bit about his journey, where he started and stuff. Just a great guy. Looking forward to getting into some more of his work.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful because he's got a passion for what he writes about. True?
Oh, yeah.
And you can't be the best at what you do unless you have a passion for what it is that you're studying. And even with the Kenny Loggins, and again, we'll unpack more, and you heard some of it today in terms of just that process of reviewing some of the content that was being crafted and created, and just the reading element to it. And we'll unpack that some more. But I thought what stood out for me is, here's a guy who loves baseball, but it's not about the baseball. He made that comment in our discussion, our full interview. So I'm not sure if it was in the second half or the first half, but he made that comment. It's not just about baseball. It's about really life. It's just this microcosm of life and the things that we experience and go through. And it really, and we're talking about assessment today, and we can't evaluate experience unless we assess it properly, right? So you and I, we talk about it several times. I know, right? This power of experience and assessing our experience, evaluating our experience. What's your process, Barry, in terms of evaluating experience?
Wow. Yeah, I think it's an evolving process. I'll start with that. I think recently I've tried to really become much more intentional on that, into reflecting, taking a look at what I've done, the results I've gotten for the efforts I'm putting forward, and really trying to understand, where do I become most productive? What can I do? What can I do in evaluating the experience, and not just the experiences I've had, but the results I've gotten, right? And I think at the end of the day, that's what's really important, because we've all got goals. We all have experiences, but what are we trying to achieve, and are we getting there? And if not, if we're falling short or not moving as fast as we want to, where's that coming from? And for me, especially over this last year, as I've been creating content around this, it's been interesting to see how much I've learned becoming a product of my own product. Because when you start looking at the things you do, right, assessing our own behavior, you start to see where you fall short quite a bit more. When you really start measuring yourself and your own actions, it can be real eye-opening. So I think that part of assessment has really changed my perspective on a lot of my own habits, my own patterns. We talked about that a couple episodes ago. But I think without that assessment and really laying in a process to evaluate that experience, we'll never see that. And so it's been an eye opener. And I think Jason was able to kind of bring in some of his process on how to do that same thing, not only for the content itself, but the process of writing. And I think, again, you've got someone very high in their field of work, and it's great to be able to share some time with those folks and pick their brain a little bit.
Yeah, it was kind of fun where he shared, we talked about Moneyball, right? And he shared, well, here's the truth of that story. And, and it doesn't take anything away from the movie. I still love the movie, but that assessment that he gave us, an insight, right, it created clarity for us. And sometimes you and I have shared it on this podcast, and you and I have done this in public discussions about the beach ball, right, Scott Fay?
Oh, yeah.
The beach ball. And I think when you talk about assessment, sometimes it comes down to that. It's getting perspective. When we asked him about interviewing different musicians, and he shared, yeah, he did. He's trying to get the other side of the beach ball. Yep. So when we talk about assessment, and maybe it will bring up some of the gaps, but I think it also will reveal the gains. Like, wait a minute, maybe you've gone further than you think you have. Maybe you're doing better than you think you have. It doesn't mean that you should stop and rest and you're there. No, we're still persevering. We're still moving forward. But it's so helpful to know, I've actually I've done this before. I've had some success. I've pushed forward. I've gone through some things. I've met the challenges. This is not my first rodeo. And those kind of aha moments, I think, are really powerful. So, and then looking back, the reason why I like Jason's story is that he's gone back in time. He's a time traveler. He's a time traveler, right? So we go back and we hear about the Dodgers or the A's, and there's actually something to learn from that. We can go back in time, learn something from that, and move forward into the future, the present, and then into the future with new knowledge and awareness. So
I love that. And I think, you're spot on when you talk about the gains, because we can't forget those things, as humans. I think we have a propensity to kind of focus on the negative. Those are the things that jump out at us. And that's where our focus can sit. So when we realize that, there's some wins in there, and use that to build a little bit of energy, little momentum, realize that, we can do this, and just learn. Again, it's assessment. It's evaluating your experience, applying the knowledge. We've all heard this: apply the knowledge, evaluate the experience. And yet that can be a challenge sometimes. So I think thinking into the gains is definitely a great way to kind of give yourself a checkup from the neck up and refocus on a positive direction. Because look, dude, as well as I do, negative stuff is all around us, and it can very easily grab us, and we need to have that positive thing somewhere that we can grab back onto and gain that clarity moving forward.
Yeah, and think about this too. Even when we face a challenge in front of us, or an endeavor, a journey that we need to take, and there's fear, there's trepidation, there's maybe doubt. Maybe we have the automatic negative thoughts like, who am I to do this or whatever. But if we take that step of courage, and courage is always a choice, right? We may not feel courageous, but we can still be courageous.
Yeah.
Right. So if we step forward with courage and pursue something, and in Kenny's case, and we heard this today, he's a collaborator. He likes to collaborate. So you guys got that bit. And if we can find somebody we can collaborate with in taking that step forward in that journey, even if we fail, we'll learn. The worst than failing is not trying. So we might as well take that step forward. And even if we fall, we'll learn. We can fall forward, as John Maxwell shares.
Yeah.
And I still love the story of the Apollo 13, right? When those guys, they didn't make it to the moon, but they made it back, and they call it a successful failure.
Yeah.
Why? Because they learned something. They learned something far more than landing on the moon, because they had already done that. But had they ever come back from a failed limb module, whatever, they used the limb module to come back, but whatever the rocket motor was that oxygenated, and they couldn't get back, and that using that, they found the limb motor to get back. And that was really the mission, is to come back safely, learn something. They did. So when we take those steps forward, whatever the journey, whatever the doubt, there's something to learn from it. And we're making gains as soon as we step forward over that line.
Yeah. And I think those gains, again, they keep you positive. It's, I know we got a topic coming up here soon about beliefs, and let's get it out there. Belief drives behavior.
Yeah,
we're gonna get in more to, get into that a little bit more at some point down the road here. But
yep,
the things were, what's a number of our mentors, where your focus goes, your energy flows.
Yeah,
and that's the bottom line. So that assessing, to me, it's an opportunity to clear out the clutter. Evaluate it, learn from it, get rid of it.
Yeah,
take out the trash.
Let's go. That's how you grow. How you grow. Well, let's encourage everybody here. Let's kind of wrap this one up. We've had a great interview, and we don't want to make this thing too long. We've got another great podcast coming up in a week. So, but let's kind of share one tip or challenge here. Maybe a word of encouragement, Barry, that you would have for everybody just in their own journey as they look back and maybe all they see are the gaps, Barry. They just see like, I got so far to go, I'll never get there. And maybe the leaf has fallen from the sky and it's messed up everything. What would be your encouragement to them?
Yeah, I think simply you got to let go of the past to embrace the future. Now, no, I did not say forget the past. You do that and you're not evaluating your experience. But you gotta let go to move forward. And I think that's the part where the assessment piece of evaluating that experience, what can you learn from it? And then focus on what you have achieved, what you have succeeded in, and move forward with that positive thinking.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. It makes me think as I listen to this book right here and learning that he was 17 years old when he wrote Danny's song. And I want to say Your Mama Don't Dance. There was like Return to Pooh Corner and Danny's song. 17 years old. He already had a hit. Anne Murray sang Danny's Boy or whatever that song was. Danny's song. And it's a great song. 17. He could have just said, "Oh, I made it." But no, he pushed forward. He continued on. He continued to be a pioneer. And I want to encourage you guys too, wherever you're at, whatever successes you've had, great, kudos. Happy and excited for you. That's fantastic, but keep going. You're not done yet. You're not done yet. There's more. So keep going, keep pursuing. Don't give up. Don't give up. So again, I can't wait. I'm almost itching to start this discussion on what we're going to talk about next, but just keep going. All right. So Barry, last thoughts as we close this one out?
Never be satisfied with average.
Yeah, for sure. Amen. Well, guys, thanks for listening to the Breaking Average podcast. Thanks to Jason Turbow for joining us. Thank you, Jason. It was fun. And we get to share part 2 of the interview with Jason Turbow in our next podcast. But you can check us out on all the different platforms. Wherever podcasts are found, we're there. We're on YouTube. We're on the Empowered Living Show. But also visit us at breakingaverage.com. We'll see you next time.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Breaking Average podcast. If you loved what you heard, please take a moment to subscribe. This show was produced by R Squared Multimedia. All opinions and comments expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not reflect the opinions or views of any of the advertisers, producers, or platforms. As you continue your day, what is one action that you can apply from this podcast to your life? Tune in for our next episode as we continue to challenge everyone to break average.